Close your eyes and come with me back to 1984. We'll take a walk down Henry Street to Dunn's department store.
This is the story of the Dunn Store strikers, 10 women and a man who pushed the Irish government to ban apartheid South African goods. In the summer of 1984, 21-year-old Mary Manning, a worker in Dunn Store's department store in Dublin's Henry Street, refused, under direction of her trade union, to sell 2 South African grapefruits to a customer. Mary was immediately suspended and some of her fellow union colleagues walked out to support her. From that day on, Mary Manning and 10 of her colleagues held a picket outside the Henry Street shop. This action sparked a strike that would last 2 years and 9 months and would eventually see Ireland become the first Western government to ban apartheid South African goods. There was a media ban in effect in South Africa at the time, and the reality on the ground was being censored. And at first the strikers had very little knowledge of the situation there and didn't really know what apartheid meant. But the more they learned, the more they understood they were standing on the right side of history. A man called Nimrod Sejake, a South African teacher living in exile in Ireland who had spent time in jail with Nelson Mandela, had a huge influence on the Dunn Store's workers. Nimrod came and joined the strikers every day on the picket line, where he shared stories with them about how the black people of South Africa were treated, how they weren't allowed to marry or own land, how they were forced out of their homes to live in black-only areas, and how they had to carry a passbook around with them at all times. Hearing these stories from a man who had first-hand experience of living under the cruel apartheid system inspired these brave strikers to continue, doing so at a huge financial and personal cost to themselves. Earning just £21 a month, some of the strikers went on to lose their homes. They come up against fierce criticism from colleagues, the Irish public and the Catholic Church in Ireland. The strike continued into the winter of 1984, and up until this time, neither the Irish public or their government had taken the strike seriously. But that began to change in December of 84, when Bishop Desmond Tutu asked to meet Mary Manning and Karen Gearan on his way to collect his Nobel Peace Prize. Here you had a black South African man of the church supporting the Dunn Store strikers and telling them that they were doing the right thing by standing against apartheid. Mary Manning and Karen Munro met with Desmond Tutu in 84 and he called for public support for the strikers. Then, in 1985, the strikers were invited by Desmond Tutu to South Africa to see for themselves what it was like to live there. The workers fundraised to fund the trip, but came up against a barrier in London's Heathrow Airport when they were told by airport officials that they needed a visa to make the trip. This was not true. After a 3-hour wait, they were eventually allowed onto the plane. When they arrived in Johannesburg, they were approached by armed soldiers, asking if they were the group travelling from Dublin. They confirmed that they were. The armed soldiers immediately escorted them to a room in the airport where they were questioned and had their luggage searched. They were held for nearly 9 hours and at one point were surrounded by up to 32 armed soldiers. They were eventually put on a plane back to London without setting foot on South African soil. On their arrival back to Heathrow, airport officials immediately approached them and took them to a press conference to give their account of what they had experienced on their trip. The South African government had just given the strikers the best publicity they could have hoped for. The media in South Africa reported that the workers were terrorists, and the next day the front page of the Irish Independent reported that the workers were described as the most dangerous shop workers in the world. The Irish public began to question what exactly was going on in South Africa that the government didn't want people to see. The strike began to pick up public interest and the Irish government realised that they needed to act. This strike was not going away. The Irish government went into talks with the union and an agreement was reached. And in April 1987, the Irish government became the first Western government to ban the import of apartheid South African goods. Nelson Mandela met with the workers when he visited Ireland in 1990 and spoke of what their stand meant to him, saying, "Young shop workers on Henry Street in Dublin, who in 1984 refused to handle the fruits of apartheid, provided me with great hope during my years of imprisonment and were an inspiration to millions of South Africans that ordinary people far away from the crucible of apartheid cared for our freedom. They would later go on to attend the South African president's funeral." These inspirational strikers have had songs, plays and documentaries written about them, and there's even a street in Johannesburg named after Mary Manning. These working class heroes were not out for better pay or better working conditions for themselves. They were out to take a stand against violations of human rights. They stood with the oppressed, and they won. If there's one lesson to take from this story, it's that committed people at the bottom can bring about change at the top, even when it seems hopeless.
Our union says don't handle them, it's the least that we can do. We fought oppression here for centuries, we'll help them fight it too.